Good evening and welcome to the first ERS Vision Live panel discussion featured exclusively on the ERS Respiratory channel. Today's discussion will focus on the behind-the-scenes advances in medicine that have been made during the COVID-19 pandemic. Looking at the response of key stakeholders in terms of innovation, improved communications and collaborations. Combined, these things all help to deliver better outcomes for patients and support healthcare systems worldwide. Today's panel, led by ERS President Professor Anita Simmons, represents some of those key stakeholders. Good evening, Professor Simmons.
Good evening, Kate, and thank you for the introduction. I'm really looking forward to participating in this new ERS initiative. I'm very happy to see that it's drawn such wide interest from the respiratory community around the world.
Supporting Anita from the European Respiratory Society is Professor Breitling, ERS Science Council Chair. Professor Breitling, welcome.
Great to be here. So, welcome to everybody from Leicester in the UK. And I'm really excited because we've got just such a fantastic panel this evening. There's great leadership that have been fighting the pandemic of COVID-19. I'm going to be really interested to hear about their insights and what they've learned. And we'll be sharing that with everybody tonight. So thank you, Kate.
It is our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Hans Kluge now. Dr. Kluge began his term as World Health Organization Regional Director for Europe on February 1st, 2020, following his nomination by the WHO Regional Committee for Europe and appointment by the WHO Executive Board. Dr. Kluge, a warm welcome.
My pleasure. Necessity and solidarity are the most important leverages for innovation and collaboration. 2020 was what I call terra incognita. We had political darkness, scientific uncertainty, but look where we are 1 year later. This year will be another pandemic year, but much more manageable and predictable. For example, with the vaccines, this has been at an unprecedented speed. But let's remember, no one is safe until everyone is safe. We need a balance between international solidarity and national responsibility.
Absolutely. And I mean, there have been a whole number of advances. Would you like to, you've mentioned some of them, but would you like to talk about some of those and how they played a part?
I would like to go back to the basics. The understanding that everything starts and finishes with health. This was logical for us health people. But when I talk to heads of states, minister of finance, this is our chance to put health high at the political agenda. That health is the conditio sine qua non, not only for well-being, also for economic development, for security, and ultimately for social cohesion. And the second thing I would say is the notion that we need to be much more proactive in One Health, the intersection between human health, animal health, and the environment.
Chris, do you have a question for Dr. Kluge?
So really impressed by the WHO response and how you've managed to take information that's been then coming out very quickly in Southeast Asia and then into Europe. So how do you think that communication has worked across that whole family of the WHO, across different regions, and being able to bring that learning very quickly into Europe?
I would say by an open mindset and improving. No one was prepared. I think we have to be very honest here. Every country, every organization, including WHO, did very good things and could have done some things better. We learned the painful lessons from the Ebola crisis, that in a crisis as WHO, which is a federated organization, works in a command and control system. And we saw this also in the countries where there was a federated system and there was a challenge between the national level and the decentralized levels. The virus had a very big appetite. So this command and control in crisis situation is very, very important.
Some of the things that worked really well were the trials, the multi-center trials, the solidarity trial. You mentioned that word earlier, REMAP-CAP trial, the recovery trial. I mean, that seems to be the way forward to repurpose drugs and put into process and practice new drugs. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And it's part of what we call the ACT accelerator, the sharing of diagnostic tools, therapies, right? Also vaccines. But we also learned we have to be solidarity, but also pragmatic. And we see this, and that's the appeal I'm making for the solidarity in the vaccinations. We have to prioritize the healthcare workers, the elderly people, but let's not wait till we have 70% in our nations vaccinated before looking across the borders. But absolutely, the solidarity clinical trial has been a key element. I want to thank many members of ERS who have contributed.
I have now the great pleasure introducing Manuela Buxo, Head of Europe, Sanofi Genzyme. Manuela, welcome.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here.
A warm welcome also to Sir Menelas Pangalos.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And so we'll move forward to our discussion. First to you, Manuela. I mean, we've been dealing with the pandemic for a full year now. How has the pharmaceutical industry reacted to COVID, and what have been your immediate actions?
I think as an industry, we really did what we do best. We mobilized our scientific capabilities and our resources for the benefits of patients. And that was really across all companies. There was a real innate desire to help in whatever way we could. And as previously said, we also learned a lot along the way. We witnessed an unprecedented level of collaboration as well within the industry and with academia. And from a Sanofi perspective, for sure, we looked for ways to, yes, leverage our vaccines capabilities to fight COVID, but we also worked very diligently to maintain supply. We heard from many physicians that supply was an immediate concern, especially in the early days. Many of the medicines treat, serious and chronic conditions, and we know that maintaining disease control was really important to avoid complications and visits to the ER. So that was really something we rallied behind, and many other companies did as well. And we're proud to say that we had zero supply outages in Europe. We maintained supply. We even received letters from the British and Spanish governments acknowledging that. And we're grateful to all of our employees who all were in very difficult circumstances themselves personally, but they all rallied behind this idea of ensuring continuity of supply for patients.
So I'd like to, if I may, bring Mene into the conversation as well. So Mene, so welcome again. And in your leadership role within AZ, you obviously needed to prioritize quite early on how you were going to tackle interventions potentially for COVID and especially vaccines. So how did you decide on your priorities? How did you think about and overcome those challenges over the last year?
First of all, I just want to agree with Manuela that I think it's been a tremendous effort by the whole industry. And I think our first priority when we started to be aware of the pandemic was, as Manuela said, to make sure that we keep continuity of supply of all of our medicines around the world. But then in short order, we started to think about, so what else can we do in terms of therapeutics to try and tackle the virus and the pandemic? And so we initially looked to reposition molecules that we had in our pipeline. Several of those studies continue to be explored, and we can talk about those later. We also started a long-acting antibody program to actually tackle the virus, whether it's in the treatment setting or the prophylactic setting using monoclonal antibodies, and those programs are in phase 3 at the moment. And then importantly, based on our knowledge and collaboration with the Oxford group, we thought we could help Oxford accelerate the development of their vaccine and the manufacturing of the vaccine as well. And so we jumped headfirst into that program as well. And we find ourselves now, I think, with a very exciting, very interesting vaccine that I think is going to be very important for helping tackle the pandemic, not just in the wealthy countries, but in all countries around the world.
So coming back to you, Manuela, obviously it was difficult during the pandemic and still is to deal with providers, healthcare teams face to face. So how have you changed what you've done? What have you done differently? And as you mentioned, you had to supply patients with really rare conditions. What have you done differently?
We've been relying much more on digital connections like this one today, which works really well. And we certainly see that continuing also post-pandemic. In 2019, for example, only 30% of all interactions were digital with healthcare providers. We expect this number to increase to 70%. So COVID hasn't fundamentally changed that trend, but it has significantly accelerated it. And we really used the opportunity to apply an omni-channel approach, but we really focused on quality over quantity, because what we've also heard many times is people felt spammed sometimes with and overloaded with too much information. Having said that, though, we've built really strong relationships with many of our physicians out there, and we're really looking forward to seeing all of them back face to face for important, significant scientific exchanges, but also simply for the day-to-day interactions that we really, really miss.
I agree. Working closely with our colleagues in industry has been important historically, but even more important in the difficult times during the pandemic. I'd like to come back to Mene. Mene, I'd like to really try and draw out some more discussion around the vaccine development. Obviously, as you alluded to, you were closely involved in working with the Oxford team, and between yourselves and Oxford then co-developed the vaccine. So I'd be interested not only in sort of your personal reflections on the success of then developing a vaccine, but if I may also then throw in there the challenges that are then already facing us in terms of new variants, and thinking about how do we keep ahead of the challenges that we have with COVID-19.
I don't think any of us would have predicted the goldfish bowl environment that we'd be working in on the vaccine program, and how every action and every event and every manufacturing step it has been so scrutinized, reported, misreported, and just the intensity of the pressure. I have to say, my relatively long career in industry, I've never done anything close to this. Like so many people, we've also been hugely energized and motivated because it's been so important. Probably the most frustrating thing for me has been media and politicians trying to play one vaccine against the other or one company against the other, when the reality is that with close to 8 billion people in the world, we need all of the vaccines to work, and we need everyone to be able to supply. And we should be thrilled whenever we hear about the success of a vaccine, whether it's Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, AstraZeneca, Sanofi, or anybody else. There's a reason that we got into this, and we've also committed to doing this not for profit, and that was because we thought it was the right thing to do from a societal and World Health perspective. And one of the reasons we've had challenges, with manufacturers, because to do the type of manufacturing we're talking about, at the scale of billions of doses in less than 9 months, and the complexity of the manufacturing chains, because we're trying to avoid the challenges of vaccine nationalism, where people, think about their population before the populations of others, which is, inherently a natural behavior, means that it's that much more complicated to produce and deliver the vaccine around the world. And our operations group, I have to say, have done an absolutely phenomenal job of doing that, whilst we've also had to manage the complexity of the clinical trials that we've run. But overall, I think I'm tremendously pleased, not just by our data, but by the data from all of the vaccines that shows that they're all highly effective at preventing serious disease, hospitalizations. And I think the data that came out this week from Public Health Scotland and Public Health England is a validation to the way the UK has approached the pandemic and actually implementing the vaccines. And I'm sure other countries will follow. And it just highlights how quickly we've been able to transform the treatment of this disease with these vaccines. Now, you touched upon variants. I'm still hopeful that even with the existing vaccines, we'll be able to treat severe disease, hospitalizations, death with the current crop of vaccines. But we're all working very hard already on generating new variant vaccines that will be ready for the autumn, so that if we do need them, particularly to treat milder or more moderate disease, we'll be ready for our next set of boosts in the coming winter season.
Just carrying on that theme of vaccines, Manuela, I know Sanofi have two vaccines. You have a recombinant protein vaccine, and you have an mRNA vaccine, and you also have therapeutics, sarilumab. I mean, how have you been prioritizing these? How are things going with the two vaccines?
For us, very similar situation. Obviously, we wanted to ensure our clinical pipeline progress, for the programs that we already had in place, while adding new programs for COVID. We were in the fortunate situation that we were able to maintain 98% of our patients in our ongoing studies. We added 4,000 new patients to our programs. We were able to significantly strengthen our immunology pipeline, including respiratory, making progress in areas like COPD, but also through acquisitions of new platform technologies. But when it comes to COVID and our vaccines, we've encountered some challenges. As you mentioned, Anita, the collaboration with GSK to develop a recombinant protein-based vaccine. We fortunately announced yesterday that we have initiated a new phase 2 trial with an optimized formulation. So if all goes well, we will move to phase 3 in Q2 of this year, and then we'll hopefully see initial deliveries of vaccine doses in Q4 for that program. For the second program that we have ongoing in partnership with Translate Bio, we're starting a phase 1/2 study still in Q1. But at the same time, coming back to this collaboration piece, we're really leveraging our expertise in manufacturing to provide both BioNTech and, as we announced yesterday as well, Johnson & Johnson, to help address some of the supply demands that we have at the moment for a COVID vaccine. So I think we've mobilized well. We have encountered really big challenges to do things, unprecedented things in a short amount of time. But we're far from done. We'll encounter more challenges in the future, but we also look forward to continuing to learn, continuing to innovate, and to collaborate within the industry and with all of you.
This is really to both Mene and to Manuela. It's about really sort of how do we think about changing approach to R&D.
So as part of our collaboration with Oxford, we've started a pandemic preparedness group that's doing obviously working with international groups to look at surveillance of new pathogens and viruses. But I think ultimately, this is a global initiative that we need to be aware of. I think what we've seen with some of the new technologies is that we can move quickly now in terms of both the speed of development, but also the speed of scaling up manufacturing. And I think now with the manufacturing capacity that's been built around the world with these new platforms, that should stand us in good stead for the future. It's also highlight the importance of having manufacturing chains and supply chains in place in the appropriate regions around the world. It's critically important to understand how the virus is mutating. We've seen it become a much better infectious agent. As we start to apply pressure on it with vaccines, it's going to be important to understand what escape mechanisms it has from the immune system, and therefore how we need to adapt our therapies accordingly. But I think the good news with these platforms is that we can adapt them quickly and move them rapidly through the clinic. The other piece that's been really important has been the interaction with regulators around the world. They've been very dynamic, very flexible. We've pretty much all done rolling submissions, and they've really helped us move at speed around the world, which is going to, I think, been hugely important.
Just to reiterate the point around pandemic preparedness, we're working certainly at European level and really across the industry on lessons learned for being prepared at European level for another crisis, for another pandemic. And then the other thing that we are championing quite strongly is really supply security, sovereignty in Europe around supply, not just for pandemic situations, but also going forward.
A pandemic is not going to be pushed back in the hospitals or by scientists. We have to bring it to the people. We have to bring it to the primary healthcare, to the community care. And that will influence the awareness and the behavior, right? Like we had for the HIV/AIDS, once there was self-tests or tests to be applied at home, this made a huge paradigm shift. And I think that's a very big one for the future and also for the preparedness. And we come back to the basics, basically. It's to strengthen our primary healthcare system, because all of this is financially not sustainable. And that's why we have to involve the grassroots workers. And my appreciation really for all the health workers and the social workers, particularly at the grassroots level, who have been holding the flag there.
Now it is time to introduce Professor Stephen Holgate.
So what I'm really going to talk about is treatments, because of course vaccines are absolutely crucial, and all the rationale for that has been so well presented in the first half of this webinar. But we do have patients still dying in hospitals across the world. I heard yesterday that, the terrible statistics in the United States, that more people have died from this disease than in both world wars put together and the war in Vietnam. And I could tell the hurt that penetrated everybody with that statistic. So we do need good treatments. The problem is that we're rather short of these at the present time. We've got treatments that are appearing now that are drugs that have already been used in other disease areas that look as if they're helping, particularly in the latter part of the disease when we have this so-called cytokine storm. But really, it's in the early part of the disease where we don't really seem to have much treatment. And this is really where, we were very excited when Synergen was able to come in and maybe play a role in this. And this research started at the university here in 2003, built on an understanding of how viruses interact with the respiratory tract. And the coronavirus, of course, was discovered in the early 1960s by David Tyrrell and Judy Almeida, here in England, and particularly in Salisbury and at St. Thomas's Hospital. And we had the pleasure of working with David Tyrrell throughout the late 1990s on some of the diagnostic tests for viruses, including human rhinovirus. And this really led us to understanding the role of viruses in asthma exacerbations and later in COPD exacerbations, and then asking the question, why were these patients more susceptible to virus infection? And this led to the discovery that there was a defect in what we call the innate immune response. That is the first immune response that the cell switches on as soon as it sees the virus to try and not only eliminate the virus at that first step, but also prevent it from colonizing other cells and causing further damage. So when we heard about this incredible, nasty virus coming in, wondered whether inhaled interferon, which we'd already shown to be effective in severe asthma and in some patients with COPD, whether it could actually protect and help patients with coronavirus infection as well. And there was a bit of background literature on all of this, which I won't rehearse. But what we discovered going forward over the last 6 to 9 months is that there's a good scientific basis for this. I mean, this virus, as we heard from many and others, has evolved in its makeup the ability to evade the innate immune response. That's why it survived so long in the bat without causing disease. Secondly, we know that in the human, there are genetic defects that predispose people to impaired interferon responses and therefore inadequate antiviral defense. And finally, we have these comorbidities, which also are all associated with reduced interferon production. So when you put all of that together, it creates a scientific rationale for giving inhaled interferon beta, which we'd previously shown can protect epithelial cells against other viruses, but this time targeted on SARS-CoV-2. And in a phase 2 clinical trial, we were able to demonstrate just that with a remarkable clinical benefit on a number of endpoints, which was very exciting. And this has enabled us now to move into international trials and into trials in the United States. The important thing here is that the drug has to be inhaled. We need high concentrations locally. And this is why the systemic interferon studies have proven so disappointing. And I wouldn't like anybody to believe that the failure of some of the systemic treatment using interferon reflects what happens when you give it by inhalation. Our trials are ongoing, and we hope to have results, obviously, this year. And with our fingers crossed, have a new treatment that will take advantage of building the patient's own immune response against viruses, irrelevant of which mutations take place.
It is my great pleasure now to introduce Katrin Pucknat, CEO and President of ResMed Germany, to the panel. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate the opportunity.
I come from the world of non-invasive ventilation, so I'd be really interested to hear what was the challenges for you at ResMed in entering the pandemic with many patients needing respiratory support, CPAP, non-invasive ventilation, and how you rose to the challenge of supplying the equipment.
Yeah, I would say the most challenging moment was when we had to start to actually prioritize our ventilator deliveries and knew that every vent would directly save a life. And we quickly made the decision as a global executive team to not sell to the highest bidder, but to prioritize our shipments to the markets with the greatest need. Our mission at ResMed is to improve the lives of people with chronic disease, and the pandemic escalated our mission to saving lives. And ethically, we felt really strong about doing the right thing, and we stuck to that guidance throughout the critical first phase of the pandemic until the supply situation had calmed down. But it was a very, very difficult time and very difficult decision-making.
For infection control reasons, you have to modify the circuits, and you had to supply a whole range of non-vented masks and other accessories. Were you able to switch production to that particular type of mask? How did that work?
Yeah, so that was also a huge challenge, not only because we saw global supply chains deteriorate, but also because logistically we were facing great challenges with airlines and air freight not being available at the regular rates. We certainly got help from a lot of countries and a lot of regions to help us obtain the products that we needed. And we were able to triple or almost 3.5 times increase our production of ventilators. So we built more than 150,000 ventilators between January and June, which was massive for our company, and we tenfolded mass production. That all translated back to an enormous endeavor by the people in our logistics and supply chain teams, as well as our global manufacturing teams. And on top of all the issues we were having obtaining the materials, we were also facing situations of consistent lockdowns in markets like in Asia, where access to some of our factories wasn't easy to get to. So we had to overcome all of that. But I must say, as a team, everybody rose to the occasion in our group, and we were able to deliver as much product as we could.
As well as managing the COVID patients, we have a range of patients at home on CPAP treatment for sleep apnea, a range of other support treatments at home, and also, with digital contact with our patients, video consults and so on. So did you see a lot of shift to digital care and home telemonitoring in that patient group?
We did. It was actually a real great accelerator for the adoption of telemonitoring and telehealth solutions. And I personally believe that digital health solutions will become an integral part of healthcare delivery in the future. When the pandemic started last spring, we decided to accelerate the launch of our telemonitoring platform for AirView for ventilation. And this enabled physicians and HMEs to support ventilated patients remotely, and in many cases kept those patients from having to visit an office or even a hospital. And certainly, since those patients suffer from severe chronic disease or respiratory conditions, it was about protecting their lives in many cases. I think it's now up to the individual countries to ensure that these innovative solutions provided are transferred into standard of care. But we do believe that COVID has put a massive financial burden on every global economy. So we have to embrace the digitalization of healthcare as a way to deliver better and more efficient care at a reduced cost.
Stephen, are you there still?
I still am.
Good. Okay. So, talking about your inhaled trials, how are they going? Is this going to be feasible to deliver the interferon beta at home?
One of the most important things here is to look at ways of helping patients to be able to get the treatments they need. And most of the treatments that are being offered at the moment are given by injection, which of course really requires hospital or at least personal contact with the patient. But this is an inhaled agent. We are doing trials at the moment using video transmission and posting the inhaler and the drug to patients so that they're dropped off at the doorstep. And then a nurse helps the patient learn how to use the inhaler, which is very straightforward. And they treat themselves at home and have regular contact over the internet with the nurse managing that particular case. So this is a home treatment we think will prevent the progression of this disease, because really what we want is to stop patients from having to go to hospital, don't we?
So I would like to make a pitch here for what I call the dual track health system approach, because looking from a public health perspective, right, we heard so many people are dying from COVID-19, but what I see now in society is this tension between the attention to the COVID-19 and what about the other diseases? In this case, we could say respiratory diseases. 1 out of 3 people in Western Europe and 1 out of 4 people in Eastern Europe will develop some form of cancer, for example. Right? What about cardiovascular disease, the number 1? So it's high time to pick up the non-COVID related diseases. We continue with all the innovation in the COVID-19, but let's pick up and continue with the rest, because otherwise the excess mortality will be too high. And one biggie I would like to point out is the mental health, the parallel pandemic of the mental health. Thank you.
No, I think that's right. It's entirely right. In the first wave of the pandemic, it was very difficult to do anything else than acutely handle COVID patients. But in the second wave, we've been able to manage the non-COVID and COVID patients somewhat better, although there's still, as you imply, a large backlog of patients that need investigations and tests. I think that's where the digitalization has helped with virtual consultations, virtual wards, and so on.
I've got a couple of questions. First to Stephen. So with the interferon beta, I mean, if I understood correctly, your suggestion really is that it's something that we should be taking to patients who've got a very early positive diagnosis and try and stop progression, or is the greater focus stopping progression to intensive care in a hospital setting, so hospital versus community?
Yeah. Our clinical trial that was published in Lancet Respiratory Medicine was hospitalized patients, and we were able to demonstrate there that we prevented patients having to go onto the ventilator, so it prevented progression in quite serious disease, but also we demonstrated more rapid recovery back to a normal state once these patients got home. So knowing that long COVID is becoming quite an issue now, one of the possibilities, of course, is that if you treat this, even in patients who do not necessarily have severe disease, one might prevent the progression into this complex chronic disorder, which is so disabling and is appearing all the time. At the moment, we don't know the answer to your question, Chris, because we haven't got the results of the home trial yet. But once we have that, we'll be able to put together, I think, and I hope, a portfolio that will be more preventative, used at the more preventative end of the spectrum, rather than trying to rescue people at the end with very severe disease.
So a question for Catherine as well. I mean, it seems to me that the pace of change in the way that we approach respiratory support was really quite phenomenal, and it didn't seem to sort of match the same scale in terms of the research that you had for drug intervention, such as the very large platform studies. So do you think there's still a gap between what we're clearly doing in practice and showing benefit for, and then being able to do research and show evidence for some of the changes in terms of the respiratory support?
Like last year, when the pandemic started, we were literally getting new information every single day around standard of care, how to treat patients in the hospital, when to put them on high flow therapy, when to not do that, what role the invasive ventilation played. And I think a lot of it was really sort of going on a day by day and learning as we went, and just the rapid acceleration of publications through the esteemed journals, I think were really helping. But I think it's also shown that research and science can change and adopt. And I think it's massive what kind of knowledge we've acquired in just a year to learn how to better manage the disease early on, but also when it comes to a more acute state.
That's true. We do have the Recovery ERS trial, where there's a randomized trial of CPAP versus high flow nasal oxygen therapy versus standard oxygen, with over 1,000 patients recruited. So we may get a clearer answer, or we may not.
I think the important thing to remember, though, is that this is a wily virus, and this is not going to be the last pandemic the world's going to see. And I think the important thing here, as we've already heard in the discussion today, we've got to get better prepared for what happens next, whether it's an aberrant flu virus or whether it's another coronavirus. Remember, the bat harbors 350 different coronaviruses. So, there's quite a reservoir out there that has a potential.
I think it was really interesting when you spoke about teaching the patients how to use the inhalers and use the drug. And I think things like adherence and proper use of the device are becoming critical. And I think that's where digitalization will also be able to play a really great role. Yeah. We're seeing through products like our Propeller Health platform that we can actually teach patients to use these devices much more efficiently in the home. And I think that's where digitalization really can play a significant role in delivering effective therapy, even in remote settings. So I think it attests to the question Professor Simmons asked earlier.
And of course, simplicity is the important thing here. People can do almost anything if it's simple and straightforward. And so technology has a lot to offer in that particular domain.
Well, we actually have a questions coming in from our audience. I've got several here to do with the vaccine. The first being, how can we speed up the production? This is to so many, but speed up the production of vaccines. Can we go any faster with production?
Well, so it's interesting, right? Because as an industry, we've never gone as fast in our lives, and of course, everyone would like to go faster. But just put it into context for we normally make millions of doses for our medicines, and this year we'll make between 2 and 3 billion doses of the vaccine, of the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, and of course, Moderna, Pfizer, J&J, others are also making their doses. So, there is a limit to how fast you can do it because our vaccine requires cells to grow and make the virus. And I think once all of the manufacturing sites around the world are up and running and have the process fully optimized, which takes time, and to do it as many times as we've done is unusual. It gets easier and easier. Now, my operations people will hate me saying that, but I do think hiccups along the way during the course of 2020, I think, would be expected. I think as the process gets better defined and as we all get more confident with the manufacturing and improving the yields, I think there's less hiccups along the way, and so the output improves every month.
But I would also add that other companies really helping to collaborate here, and several have already stepped up to help manufacture more vaccines, for other companies. I think that will also help ease some of the demand constraints that we're still facing at the moment.
It's definitely the number one challenge for me in having ministers and prime ministers calling every day on the vaccine. So first and foremost, my appreciation to everyone on the panel who I agree this is an unprecedented speed. But one is to share technology transfer, because the whole issue of the patents, I think, is a whole different ballgame, and that's something, right? But practical, I heard it, right? It's previously competing companies who could help to beef up the production capacity. Number 2 is technology transfer, and number 3 is to broaden the portfolio of vaccines. That's why WHO headquarters is working now with the Russian Federation on the Sputnik V to get it into the emergency use listing. There are Chinese vaccines which are getting into the WHO pre-qualification as well. So one thing is the production, but the other thing is also to broaden the portfolio of vaccines, and that's something that we should welcome. Thank you.
So I completely agree with that. The other piece that's very important, and I think is going to become very real in the implementation and is actually going to give countries and regions more flexibility, is understanding the role of heterologous boosting. I think it's quite likely that we will see vaccines being interchanged, mRNA being interchanged with adenovirus being interchanged with adenovirus being interchanged with inactivated vaccines. And of course, that means then that it becomes much easier to deploy vaccines around the world. And so the experiments that we and others are doing to understand heterologous boosting, how you can prime or boost with different types of vaccines, I think will also add flexibility to the supply chains around the world.
And how are the trials, Sameli, going to work in that situation? Because there's so many questions we need to answer. There's variants. It'd be difficult to do placebo-controlled trials in some countries. Are we going to be largely based on phase 2 trials? How are we going to do these large phase 3 trials?
It's a great question. They won't. So the FDA actually just issued yesterday some guidance, and I think regulatory groups around the world are starting to issue, and they've thought about it and starting to issue. For the existing vaccines, I think that the approvals for next-gen variants will largely be based on immunogenicity. And as we start to understand the correlates of immune protection, people right now are focusing understandably on neutralizing antibody levels, but T-cell responses and other immune response are going to be important as well. I think we will be using correlates of immune protection, such as neutralizing antibody titers, immunogenicity, to update vaccines, as we do with flu every year.
I have another one on pharma as well. Actually, it's quite controversial, saying several pharma companies have left the respiratory field in the last few years. Will the pandemia bring back the focus onto respiratory disease, do we think?
We certainly have wider ambitions. And for those of you that have followed our capital markets day or some of our research days that we've had, you can see that we really believe in respiratory as an area, but also in the transition of respiratory care from treating the manifestations of disease to understanding the root causes of many of those diseases. So we're investing quite a bit in immunology, partially in Dupixent, but also beyond Dupixent, as some of our recent acquisitions have also shown. And we're really changing how we think about this space. So definitely, from a Sanofi perspective, more to come in the future in respiratory for sure.
And actually, we have a very exciting program together, Manuela. We have nirsevimab, which we're doing together,
yes.
Which is for RSV, which is a
Exactly.
very exciting antibody, which I'm sure is going to be a very successful and very important medicine.
I've got one for you, Steve. We have to ask you a question from the audience about inhaled budesonide and the recent study showing benefit in COVID from a relatively small trial, but still very, very interesting. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. It is interesting, but of course, an inhaled steroid, having spent my life in asthma, is an anti-inflammatory agent. And as far as we understand, unless there's entirely new data, it probably isn't able to tackle the virus itself. And of course, the virus is the virus. So whether inhaled steroids actually prevents the virus from progressing down the lung or just neutralizes some of the inflammation, I don't know. And as I understand it, this wasn't a placebo-controlled trial. So we know that in any lung disease, unless one does very large numbers, like the recovery trial, it's quite difficult sometimes to be able to know precisely how much of the response you can direct towards the drug itself and how much is due to the patient receiving something that they know may help.
There was a very small study. It was only 10 events, so I think you have to take it with a pinch of salt. There are larger studies being run with inhaled corticosteroids and with Symbicort as well, that hopefully will answer the question about its role in preventing people from progressing with their disease. The other, I think, therapeutics are important to mention are actually the antibody therapeutics, because they can be given both prophylactically, but they also can be given in the outpatient treatment setting. And they're obviously targeting the virus very specifically and have been shown to knock down viral load very, very dramatically. And those are obviously moving very rapidly. Well, some are approved, but there are more also rapidly moving through development. I think they're going to be very powerful agents.
I would like to finish with a positive note, because what I have seen in the COVID times is an unprecedented collaboration between public sector and private sector. And private sector has helped out really in a number of cases where traditional market mechanism failed. So on what I would like to see in the future on innovation and collaboration is to ride this positive wave to work together on a new social pact between public and private sector for affordable, innovative medicines, because that is going to break the health systems from a financial sustainability point of view. So is to work together. We understand that pharmaceutical companies need to have the revenue to drive innovation. That's perfectly understandable, but not at the cost of the patient. So to come to a new kind of a pact over there to make particularly innovative medicines for rare diseases affordable. I think that will be a fantastic outcome of this COVID-19 tragedy.
I think one of the other things I was interested really is this with the last comment for people is around also platform trials and successes of platform trials, and whether we think we can do more to then bring some of these new interventions, both in terms of technology interventions, but also drug interventions into platforms such as WHO platforms or national studies such as those in the UK and others.
Got to be much more imaginative and much more speedy the way we deliver our trials. I mean, quite often it takes years for drugs to get through the old traditional phase 1, 2, and 3, and then eventually phase 4 follow-up trials. And we really, there's no real reason for this. I mean, there are now fantastically new types of trial which we can invest in. And I think cancer in many ways has led the way here prior to this COVID, when we've had such trials as the Matrix trial, which has been absolutely phenomenal in terms of lung cancer. But I mean, we have to be imaginative, I think, Chris, and we have to think of better ways and speedier ways of learning whether something's going to work without side effects, and if so, getting into the clinic far faster.
we're participating in Active 2 and Active 3, Accord and Recovery, and I think they've been fantastic. I would say the only thing that you'd want to happen is to see them happen even faster, like everything, in the same way that we want everything to happen faster. They sometimes take a while to set up, and often if you're in a company, you sometimes feel you can do it faster if you do it on your own. So I think speed and setup is critically important for these things, and being able to cycle through molecules quickly.
Great points on platform trials around agility, speed, and collaboration to then really get innovation into the clinic. Fantastic.
Yeah, hugely powerful in terms of what they delivered. So, very supportive.
Thanks, Sinead. Great summary from Dr. Kluger around the necessity to take all of what we've learned that has been undertaken primarily in the industrialized countries, and how we can actually truly globalize innovation from COVID-19. I think that was an incredibly important and powerful message.
Just to say one last comment. We work on many diseases that are very, terrible, debilitating, huge unmet medical need. And I think the interactive way that we've worked with many regulatory bodies around the world, it would be lovely if that carried on through beyond COVID.
Just to support that, an investment in the regulators. I think the European Medicines Agency, the MHRA, the FDA, they all talk to each other. As you say, the process of the trials is iterative, many questions coming in all the time. And I think, yes, if we can, the rolling reviews would work well. If we can roll that out to the regulation of all drugs in future, and as you say, devices, the European Medicines Agency remit is due to be extended to look at devices for emergency use. So that would be tremendously valuable. Yes, huge thanks to the panel, also to our audience at home and for your questions. And the ERS Vision Live will continue on a monthly basis. So we'll be doing this regularly, and we look forward to seeing you next month.